Death row flow, I've been going loco. Niggas broke, I might just pull it from the logo. And trap it like a dojo.
Friday evening, May 24th, 2024, 6:30 p.m. Patrolling officers on Kansas City's east side heard what they'd heard too many times before, the sharp crack of gunshots cutting through rush hour traffic. But this time, witnesses were pointing frantically toward a car wash just off the Van Brunt Boulevard exit from Interstate 70. What they found there would become the city's 57th homicide of the year. Inside a bullet-riddled pickup truck sat Kevion Bifford, slumped over the wheel, blood pooling across the dashboard. The driver's side window was shattered, the front tire blown out by gunfire. Emergency medical personnel rushed to the scene, but it was already too late. Two Gun Kevy, the name that echoed through Kansas City's underground rap scene, had taken his last breath in a car wash parking lot, just blocks from the neighborhood where he'd grown up. Officers noticed something else. In the back seat, untouched despite the chaos, sat a designer Gucci bag. Nobody knows what was inside. The police never disclosed its contents. Street theories ranged from cash from a recent transaction to something far more valuable, something worth killing for. That bag would become one of the haunting questions that still circles this case today, nearly 2 years later with 0 arrests. Here's what makes this case different from the dozens of other shootings that plagued Kansas City that year. Kevion Bifford wasn't some reckless teenager caught up in his first beef. This was a 27-year-old man who'd survived 9 years in federal prison. A man who'd won Best Male Rap Artist at the 2021 Kansas City People's Choice Awards. A man whose track Vent had surpassed 1 million views, where he collaborated with Kansas City legend Tech 9 himself. This was someone who knew the streets, someone who understood the game, someone who'd been shot in the mouth back in 2008 and survived. Yet here he was, caught in broad daylight, during rush hour on a Friday evening, only 4 years after walking out of federal custody. How does someone with that much survival instinct, that much street intelligence, end up dead at a car wash before he even turns 30? That's the question that keeps people up at night. Because if Two Gun Kevy, smart, aware, successful, trying to change, couldn't escape the pull of the streets, then who can? The answer to that question is buried somewhere between the exit ramp, where the shooting started, and the abandoned car wash, where his truck finally stopped rolling. And what you're about to hear will show you exactly why this case became more than just another statistic. Before we go further, let me be honest with you. If you actually care about understanding how cycles of violence trap even the smartest people who are trying to do better, then hit subscribe. And if you're sitting there thinking you're too smart to be manipulated by a YouTube algorithm, well, the comment section is right there waiting for you to explain why you're different. Because this story isn't just about Kevion Bifford. It's about every person who thought they could outrun their past. Let's go back to where this really started. Because Kevion Bifford wasn't born into rap fame or street legend status. He was born in the late 1980s to a teenage mother on Kansas City's east side, in a neighborhood where survival meant adaptation and the sound of gunfire was as familiar as the ice cream truck rolling through in summer. This wasn't some wealthy kid who chose the streets for the thrill. This was a kid who entered that life at 15 or 16 years old because that's what the environment demanded. His rap career started the way so many hood dreams begin, completely by accident. Back in 2003, Kevion and his cousin were just messing around in his aunt's basement with the Fisher-Price recorder. You know the kind. Those cheap plastic toys that parents buy at Walmart thinking their kids will record birthday messages or silly songs. But when you grow up where Kevion grew up, you don't record nursery rhymes. You record what you see, what you live, what's happening on the block. And something happened when Kevion put those headphones on. Something clicked. His cousin later said they'd spend entire days down there, freestyling over beats they'd play from a boom box, rewinding the same instrumental over and over until they got their verses right. It wasn't about getting famous. It wasn't even about making money at first. It was just two kids finding an outlet, a way to process the chaos around them. But like his cousin said in interviews years later, when you mess around with that stuff, it gets addictive. The rhythm, the wordplay, the way you can turn pain into something people actually want to hear. But while Kevion was developing his craft in that basement, he was also developing connections on the streets. And those connections would eventually define his life more than any rap verse ever could. He became affiliated with the Click Clack Gang, a criminal organization that took its name from the distinct mechanical sound of chambering a round in a semi-automatic handgun. That sound, click-clack, became synonymous with a crew involved in crack cocaine distribution, firearms trafficking, and the kind of violence that eventually draws federal attention. Kansas City's East Side in the 2000s wasn't just a backdrop for music videos. It was a war zone where territorial disputes got settled with bullets, where 14-year-olds carried pistols to school, and where the local police seemed perpetually one step behind. Kevion's neighborhood, 33rd and Bells, became known as click-clack territory. If you rolled through there wearing the wrong colors or claiming the wrong set, you might not roll back out. That was just the reality. Now here's where the story takes its first dark turn. On a night in 2007, a nightclub shooting changed everything. Kevion Bifford was involved, and surveillance footage from the club placed him at the scene. The kind of footage that doesn't lie, doesn't forget, and doesn't care about street code. Police arrested him for second-degree murder, the kind of charge that could bury a 20-something rapper before his career ever had a chance to take off. We're talking about potentially spending the rest of his life behind bars. But here's what actually happened, and this is where the whisper started. Kevion pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, unlawful use of a firearm. Instead of life in prison, he received 3 years of probation with a 15-year suspended sentence hanging over his head. Meanwhile, his co-defendant in the same case, a man named Richard Cooper, wasn't so lucky. Richard Cooper got life. Let me repeat that. One person walks away with probation. The other gets life in prison for the same incident. Now, prosecutors and defense attorneys will tell you this happens all the time. Different levels of involvement, different criminal histories, different deals cut based on what the state can prove. But in the streets, where reputation is currency and perception is reality, people don't care about legal nuances. They do math. And the math here was simple. Kevion walked, Richard didn't. The question became, what did Kevion give up to earn that difference? According to street sources and court documents that later surfaced, Kevion allegedly provided police with specific details about a shooter. A description of someone with the chop with a banana clip, street slang for an AK-style rifle with an extended magazine. Someone with dreadlocks. Details specific enough to be useful in an investigation. Details that, true or not, would follow Kevion Bifford for the rest of his life. Because in the code that governs neighborhoods like 33rd and Bells, there's no greater sin than cooperation. No worse label than the one that was now being whispered behind his back. The allegations of snitching weren't just street gossip. They had consequences. Real, bloody consequences that would manifest less than a year later in a way that should have killed Kevion Bifford but somehow didn't. And that survival, that refusal to die when he was supposed to, only made the questions louder and the suspicions deeper. 2008. Less than a year after the nightclub case wrapped up, Kevion Bifford did something that, in hindsight, looks like either incredible courage or complete stupidity, depending on who you ask. He went to visit Richard Cooper in jail. The same Richard Cooper who got life, while Kevion walked away with probation. The same Richard Cooper whose family and friends were convinced Kevion had cooperated with police to save his own skin. Think about that decision for a second. Walking into a jail to face someone who believes you're the reason they'll never breathe free air again. Either Kevion genuinely wanted to clear the air, to explain what really happened in that courtroom, or he was trying to prove something to the streets, that he wasn't what they were saying he was. Whatever his motivation, that visit set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Shortly after that jail visit, Kevion was shot. But not just shot, he was shot in the mouth. And if you understand anything about street symbolism, you know that wasn't random. When someone gets shot in the mouth, it's a message. It's saying, this is what happens when you talk. It's saying, your words got you this. The placement was deliberate, calculated, meant to send a signal to everyone watching. This is the price of cooperation. But here's what makes this moment so critical to understanding Kevion's story. He survived. Against the odds, against the intentions of whoever pulled that trigger. Kevion Bifford survived a point-blank gunshot to the face. The bullet entered through his mouth, somehow missed vital arteries and his brain stem, and he lived to tell about it. Except he didn't tell. And that refusal to speak would become the defining contradiction of his entire life. When investigators pressed him for information, when they asked who shot him, where it happened, why someone would want him dead, Kevion made a statement that was supposed to clear his name once and for all. He said, and this is documented, "Even if I knew who shot me, I would not prosecute because I am not a snitch or a rat." Read that again. He took a bullet to the mouth and still refused to cooperate with police about his own attempted murder. On the surface, that sounds like the ultimate proof of street loyalty, right? That sounds like someone living by the code, refusing to break no matter what. But here's the problem. The streets don't forget, and they definitely don't forgive contradictions. If you won't snitch about your own shooter, then why did you allegedly describe a shooter in someone else's case? If the code matters so much now, where was that code when Richard Cooper was getting sentenced to life? The math still wasn't adding up. And in neighborhoods where people spend their entire lives reading between the lines, looking for inconsistencies, trying to figure out who's really solid and who's just playing a role, those contradictions are fatal. Literally. Because the question hanging over Kevion wasn't just, did he cooperate in 2007? It was, can we trust him now? And in that world, doubt is a death sentence that just takes time to execute. What people outside the streets don't understand is that once that label attaches to you, once people start calling you a snitch, a rat, someone who cooperates, it doesn't matter what you do after. You can take a bullet and stay silent. You can do everything by the code from that moment forward. But the suspicion never dies. It just sits there, waiting for the right moment, the right conflict, the right excuse to resurface. And for Kevion, that moment was coming. Between 2009 and 2011, Kevion was arrested 8 more times. 8 separate incidents, each one involving drugs and firearms, each one following the same pattern. Witnesses don't show up to testify. Evidence gets suppressed, cases get dismissed or beaten at trial. On paper, it looked like Kevion had mastered the system, like he'd figured out how to operate just below the threshold of what prosecutors could actually prove in court. But that's exactly the kind of success that makes local police look incompetent. That's exactly the kind of pattern that makes district attorneys furious. And when you make the local system look bad enough times, when you beat enough cases and walk out of enough courtrooms with that smirk on your face, someone makes a phone call. Someone downtown decides it's time to change the game. Someone calls the feds. And when federal prosecutors get involved, they don't just charge you with what you did last Tuesday. They don't build a case around one incident or one arrest. They go back years. They connect dots that local police never bothered to connect. They turn your entire life into a conspiracy charge. And that's exactly what happened to Kevion Bifford on February 10th, 2011, when a federal grand jury unsealed an indictment that would reshape not just his life, but Kansas City's entire hip-hop scene. This wasn't just another drug case. This was the federal government treating the Click-Clack gang like an organized crime syndicate. And Kevion Bifford was about to learn that surviving the streets is one thing. Surviving the feds is something else entirely. February 10th, 2011. While most of Kansas City was going about their regular Thursday, federal agents were executing synchronized raids across the east side. Doors were being kicked in before sunrise. Search warrants were being served at addresses connected to the Click-Clack gang. And sitting in a courthouse downtown was a sealed indictment that had taken investigators nearly 2 years to build. A 12-count federal conspiracy case that would dismantle an entire organization. Kevion Bifford wasn't alone in that indictment. 7 co-defendants were named, including his own brother, Kevin Levance Jackson. Think about that weight for a second. Your own blood, your own family, caught up in the same federal case that's about to tear through your life. This wasn't some random street beef anymore. This was the federal government invoking statutes designed to prosecute organized crime, specifically Title 18, United States Code, Section 521, which allows for gang enhancements that can add up to 10 years per count. The charges against Kevion read like a greatest hits album of federal drug and gun crimes. conspiracy to distribute 28 grams or more of crack cocaine, possession with intent to distribute, felon in possession of a firearm, possessing firearms in furtherance of drug trafficking, distribution of cocaine base. Each charge carried mandatory minimum sentences that, when stacked together, could have put Kevion away for decades. This was the kind of case that doesn't go to trial and end with probation. But here's what made this case different from typical street-level drug arrests. The evidence the feds had accumulated was overwhelming. They'd recovered more than 20 firearms from various incidents connected to the Click-Clack organization. And these weren't just guns, several were stolen. Others had been illegally modified with extended magazines and autosear conversions. Some of these weapons were ballistically matched to shootings across Kansas City's east side. At least one was connected to an unsolved homicide that still sits in a cold case file somewhere. The drug evidence was equally damning. Over 40 grams of crack cocaine, more than 100 grams of powder cocaine, marijuana, ecstasy pills, and nearly $2,500 in cash, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that's just what they found during the raids. Federal prosecutors argued this represented just a fraction of the actual drug distribution network the Click-Clack gang had been operating for years. They had wiretaps. They had surveillance footage. They had cooperating witnesses ready to testify. This is where Kevion's previous legal victories stopped mattering. All those dismissed cases, all those times witnesses didn't show up to local court, all those charges that got reduced or beaten at trial. None of that helps when federal prosecutors come with RICO-adjacent charges. Because the feds don't need witnesses who are too scared to testify. They have recordings. They have financial records. They have evidence that doesn't get intimidated in parking lots or change its story on the stand. When the judge handed down Kevion's sentence, it was 12 years in federal prison. 12 years is a long time to think about your choices. 12 years is enough time for your kids to grow up without you. 12 years is the kind of sentence that's supposed to break people, supposed to make them cooperate, supposed to turn them into exactly what the streets already suspected Kevion might be. But he took that sentence and started serving his time. Now here's where we hit the second major mathematical problem in Kevion's story, the one that would reignite all those snitching allegations years later when he walked out. Kevion only served 9 years of that 12-year sentence. He was released in March 2020, right as the COVID-19 pandemic was shutting down the world. While his co-defendants, including his own brother, were still behind bars, still fighting appeals, still grinding through their sentences, Kevion Bifford walked out a free man. The legal explanation is straightforward and actually applies to thousands of nonviolent drug offenders across the country. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine offenses, a disparity that had disproportionately affected black defendants for decades. Then came the First Step Act of 2018, which made those reforms retroactive and allowed prisoners serving under the old guidelines to petition for sentence reductions. Kevion's lawyers filed the paperwork, the judge approved it, and combined with good behavior credits, he shaved 3 years off his sentence. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't evidence of cooperation. Federal public defenders will tell you they handled hundreds of these cases under the First Step Act. Prison reform advocates celebrated these releases as long overdue corrections to unjust sentencing laws. But none of that legal context matters when you're sitting in a cell watching someone walk out early while you're still counting down years. None of that matters to families who believe their loved ones got harsher sentences because they didn't play ball. And here's the brutal truth about perception versus reality in cases like this. It doesn't matter that Kevion's release was legally justified. It doesn't matter that thousands of other prisoners benefited from the same reforms. What matters is how it looked. Co-defendant gets life in 2007, while Kevion gets probation. Kevion serves 9 years instead of 12, while others serve their full sentences. The pattern, true or not, fair or not, feeds the narrative that something else was going on. This is where we need to pause and understand something critical about how the streets and the legal system speak completely different languages. To a defense attorney, Kevion's case represents successful advocacy and sentencing reform working as intended. To a federal prosecutor, It's just policy changes being applied consistently across eligible defendants. But to someone sitting in a cell who didn't get the same breaks, who didn't catch the same legal wins, it looks like favoritism. It looks like there's a reason this one person keeps landing on his feet. And that gap, that space between legal reality and street perception, is where people get killed. Because Kevion Bifford walked out of federal prison in March 2020 thinking he'd paid his debt, thinking he could finally build something different. But there were people who'd been watching, counting, remembering, and they were building their own case against him that had nothing to do with courts or judges or sentencing guidelines. March 2020. Kevion Bifford walked out of federal prison into a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. The COVID-19 pandemic was shutting down entire cities. People were wearing masks to the grocery store. Businesses were closing. The streets were quieter than they'd been in decades. But for someone who just spent 9 years locked in a cage, even a pandemic-stricken world felt like freedom. And Kevion was determined to make it count. Within months of his release, he dropped a track called Vent that would change everything. This wasn't just another street anthem full of threats and bravado. This was 9 years of suppressed emotion, anger, pain, and reflection poured into 4 minutes of raw honesty. He rapped about missing his kids' childhoods, about the conversations he had with lifers in federal prison, about realizing that the life he'd been living wasn't leading anywhere except back to a cell or a grave. And people felt it. Vent exploded past 1 million views on YouTube. For a Kansas City underground rapper, that's massive. That's the kind of number that gets you noticed, not just locally but regionally, nationally. Suddenly, Kevion wasn't just two-gun Kevy from 33rd and Bells anymore. He was an artist with legitimate buzz, with a story that resonated beyond his neighborhood. People who'd never set foot in Kansas City were commenting on his videos, sharing his music, talking about his journey. The collaborations started rolling in. Tech Nine, Kansas City's biggest hip-hop export, a legend who'd built an independent empire, reached out to work with Kevion. Studio B wanted features. Sulaifor was calling. Walter Edwin, another respected Kansas City artist, became not just a collaborator, but a friend. These weren't just co-signs from random rappers. These were established artists betting their reputations on Kevion, vouching for him, bringing him into rooms he never could have accessed before prison. Then came 2021 and validation that 9 years earlier would have seemed impossible. Kevion won Best Male Rap Artist at the Kansas City People's Choice Awards. Not nominated, won. Beat out other artists who'd been grinding the whole time he was locked up. Artists who didn't have federal cases or street rumors following them around. And he won because the music was undeniable, because his story connected, because people believed he'd genuinely transformed himself. But here's what most people don't talk about when they discuss Kevion's post-prison success. They don't talk about the cost. In interviews after his release, Kevion spoke with devastating honesty about what 9 years in federal prison had done to his relationship with his children. He had kids before he went in. Kids who were barely old enough to remember him when he came out. And he had a newborn waiting for him. A child he met for the first time as a grown man fresh out of custody. He talked about how his maturity level, when he caught his case, was nowhere close to where it needed to be. How being a father from behind bars meant missing everything that actually matters. First steps, first words, school plays, birthdays. The mundane daily moments that build the foundation of parenthood. He said his kids were cool, but you could hear the pain in his voice when he said it. That distance, that lost time, that's something no award and no streaming numbers can ever give back. And here's where Kevion's story becomes a case study in the impossible tightrope that formerly incarcerated people walk when they try to reintegrate. He was focused on being a better father. He was talking about entrepreneurship, about building something sustainable beyond music. He was actively distancing himself from gang life, from the click-clack affiliation that had defined his 20s. In interviews, he talked about being a trendsetter, representing Kansas City with pride, showing young people there was another path. But the music industry, especially in hip-hop, has a cruel paradox built into it. Your street credibility is often what makes you authentic. What makes people believe your music? What separates you from rappers who are just playing a character? But the moment you actually try to leave that life behind, the moment you start prioritizing business over beef, you risk being seen as soft. as someone who's lost their edge. As a target, Kevion tried to navigate this by shifting his ratio. Before prison, by his own admission, he was maybe 25% focused on money and 75% on street politics, on funk, on drilling, on maintaining his reputation through violence. After prison, he flipped it. 75% money, 25% keeping his name respected in the streets. That sounds like growth. That sounds like someone making better decisions. But to a certain type of person watching from the outside, it looked like weakness. He stopped explicitly naming enemies in his tracks the way younger Kansas City rappers were doing. The new generation was putting full government names in their songs, taunting dead Opps, broadcasting their locations on social media, treating violence like content. Kevion wasn't doing that anymore. He was keeping things more coded, more professional. And while that probably kept him from catching new charges, it also meant he wasn't performing the kind of recklessness that proves you're still dangerous. Here's what prison reform advocates don't always tell you. The system claims it wants people to change, to grow, to become productive citizens. But the streets don't reward growth. They punish perceived weakness. And mainstream society doesn't make it easy either. Kevion had a federal conviction on his record. That means most legitimate jobs were off the table. That means housing applications got denied. That means he was trying to build a legal income stream in an industry that's still largely cash-based and connected to the same streets he was trying to leave. So, what was he really doing for money? In his songs, he said he was hustling, that he was up in the six figures and heading toward 7. For someone with his background, with his connections, with limited legal options, that likely meant he was still involved in some form of street economy. Maybe not the same level as before prison. Maybe more careful, maybe more strategic, but probably not completely clean either. Because how do you go from federal drug conspiracy to legitimate six-figure income in 4 years with no college degree and a felony record? This is the impossible situation that traps so many people who leave prison with genuine intentions to change. You can't get a regular job that pays enough to support your family. You have skills and connections from one world, but you're trying to operate in another. So you end up in this gray area, not all the way in the streets, but not all the way out either. Making money however you can while trying to convince yourself and everyone watching that you're different now, that you're better, that this time will be different. And maybe it would have been. Maybe Kevion really was building towards something sustainable. Maybe another 5 years down the line, he would have been fully legitimate, fully out, living off music royalties and business ventures. But time is the one thing the streets don't give people who are trying to change. Because while Kevion was focused on his redemption arc, someone else was writing a different ending to his story. Someone who didn't care about his awards or his streaming numbers or his newborn baby. Someone who was just waiting for the right moment. May 24th, 2024. 6:30 in the evening. Friday, the beginning of Memorial Day weekend. Interstate 70 was packed with rush hour traffic, people heading home from work, families starting their holiday plans early. The usual chaos of a major highway cutting through Kansas City's east side. Somewhere in that sea of vehicles was Kevion Bifford's pickup truck, approaching the Van Brunt Boulevard exit. What happened next is still unclear, and that ambiguity is part of what makes this case so haunting. Some witnesses told police they heard arguing between vehicles on the highway itself, voices shouting over engine noise, windows down, the kind of confrontation that escalates from words to violence in seconds. Others said the shooting started right at the exit ramp, like someone had been waiting there, like they knew exactly which exit Kevion would take. Either way, multiple gunshots shattered the Friday evening calm. The shooter or shooters, because nobody knows for certain if it was one person or multiple, didn't just fire a warning shot or aim for the tires. They unloaded on that truck with the kind of intent that leaves no room for survival. Bullets punched through the driver's side door, shattered the window, blew out the front tire, turned that vehicle into a rolling crime scene. And somewhere in that barrage, at least one round found Kevion. Here's what makes this particularly calculated. Whoever did this knew Kevion's truck. You don't just randomly start shooting at vehicles during rush hour on a Friday evening unless you're absolutely certain you've got the right target. They either recognized the vehicle from a distance, or they saw Kevion through the window, or someone had been tracking his movements and knew exactly where he'd be. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a planned execution that just happened to occur in one of the most public places imaginable. Kevion, even while bleeding, even with his truck shot to pieces and a tire blown out, managed to keep driving. He made it off the exit ramp, turned onto Van Brunt, and somehow navigated his dying vehicle to a car wash just blocks from his own neighborhood. The same car wash where he'd probably washed that truck dozens of times before. An abandoned building that used to be full of people, but now sat empty, closed down. Just another forgotten piece of infrastructure in a neighborhood that had seen too much violence. That's where the truck finally stopped rolling. That's where officers found him slumped over the wheel, the engine still running, that Gucci bag sitting untouched in the back seat, like a silent witness to whatever transaction or situation had led to this moment. Emergency medical personnel tried everything. Chest compressions, ventilation, the full protocol for gunshot trauma. But Kevion Bifford was already gone. The investigation into Kevion's murder hit a wall almost immediately. Despite happening during rush hour on a Friday evening, despite multiple witnesses hearing the shots, despite surveillance cameras at the nearby gas station that should have captured something useful, nobody's talking. The $25,000 reward sits unclaimed. No arrests have been made. Kansas City police publicly stated they believe people know more than they're willing to share, but that knowledge stays locked behind the same code that Kevion himself invoked back in 2008. Then came the social media chaos. According to multiple street sources, a rapper named 2 Times, who operated out of 33rd and Indiana, literally the next block over from Kevion's territory, allegedly posted something on his Instagram story hours after the murder. Something mocking. Something that crossed the line from rivalry into disrespect of the dead. The post was quickly deleted, and 2 Times later claimed he and Kevion were cool, but the damage was done. The streets started connecting dots that may or may not actually connect. Here's what we know about the friction between them. People always said 2 Times sounded like 2 Gun, that he was trying to copy Kevion's style, and 2 Times hated that comparison. Both had similar names. Both were from adjacent blocks. Both were rising in Kansas City's rap scene. Whether that professional jealousy translated into actual street beef is speculation. But the timing of that alleged post, the quickness of its deletion, the defensive follow-up, it all fed theories that continue to circulate today. With Kevion's death, the Click-Clack gang effectively ended. The older members are either dead, locked up, or aged out of the life. Duck Sauce is gone. Kevion's gone. The era of Kansas City rap that they represented, that raw, unfiltered street documentation from 33rd and Bells, died in that car wash parking lot. What remains is an unsolved homicide, a grieving family, and 3 children who will grow up hearing about their father from everyone except their father.